next up is rigging this guy. So I've got his UVs all mapped out, and now I'm gonna make the joints and bones and connect all those to the mesh and hopefully hook it up so that it works like a real human or a real fake cartoon medieval guy. For some reason, my version of Maya won't display bones properly in viewport 2.0, so I just went and enabled uh, the legacy high quality viewport. So it just draws weird lines between joints, and you can't really tell what you're looking at. But this works fine. I don't really need viewport 2.0 for anything. I use projected centering when I'm putting my joints into place. It's not maybe not the most accurate way, but it definitely gets the job done. And if I need to make any adjustments, I know that the starting point is pretty good. The skeleton for this guy came together very quickly. I was looking at the Unity documentation because I'm planning to bring this character into the Unity game engine. I went over and checked their skeleton system to see if I wanted to make mine roughly correspond so that here's me looking at Mechanim right now. Double check in, try to make sure that my bones correspond to Unity's Mechanim skeleton structure so that I could share animations with Unity characters, use animations that the community has made, and possibly, put my animations out there and let them be used on other characters or try to use them on other characters that people have put with Unity. Once the skeleton is completed, I start my skinning off with this interactive skinner, which does a does a fairly good job out of the box of using all the nearest neighbors to apply influences to the vertices and gives you an opportunity to go in and make some sort of medium scale changes before applying those influences. After that, I go in and move some pieces around, try and test how certain areas are going to work. I wasn't sure how the ankles were going to work. I put these pieces kind of covering up the ankles, and that's really where deformations have to take place. So at this point, I made the decision that those two pieces of the shoe are also going to be soft skins, so that whenever his ankle moves, that part of the shoe will deform and not his leg or the shoe itself, just those pieces around the ankle. Which as long as the ankle doesn't move too far, works good enough. So I don't know what those pieces are. Are they leather? Are they metal? I'm not I'm not too worried about it. Maybe they should just be leather. Maybe that would make more sense. I'm not particularly worried if it makes sense or not. I also skinned those bands around his knee pads just so that they might bend, they might warp a little bit as his knee bends, and it helped me keep them in position behind the knee since the knee is a skin. He's got these weird, really pole-like legs that just sort of jut out of his pants, out of his butt. So it was a bit of a struggle to get them to be able to pose in a really extreme position without penetrating through his body, which I wasn't too worried about making it perfect for this. He's not going to have a super high range of motion, but putting him into poses like this helps me determine what his range of motion can be and get a look at what his deformed skin is going to look like. I also impaled him with this rod, the idea there being that that lets me see how far his spine is actually turned. That prism is just parented directly into his spine. So that lets me see how far the skeleton is turned, and then I can start to mess with his skin and see how much influence I need to add around his chest to get the center of his chest close to lining up with that pin. It's not exact. Like his maybe it intercepts his spine, but definitely not his sternum. The chest is definitely where most of the time was spent, where it's the confluence of the two of his spines and his shoulders and his upper arms. And actually, yeah, at that point he didn't have shoulder joints. I started trying to do just one bone for his upper arm, and I can never get that to work quite right. So even though that's not the best idea, I went back in and added a shoulder joint, which wasn't too tough to do after I had already started skinning, but definitely could have saved a lot of work just by finalizing that skeleton structure before I got this far. So these joints at the top of his chest need to share influence between his neck and his shoulders and his spines, and it's a little bit of a nightmare. I don't like to use paint weighting or weight painting tools like many people prefer to use. I tend, like you've seen, I just have the component editor open and I'm looking at the spreadsheet of influences, making selections over in the viewport, and then just removing joints that I don't need to have influence, and where there's shared influence, kind of go down the list, highlight a series of vertices, and set them all to the same value. Although there's just a couple of spots that need a little more nuance than that. Sort of in the legs, crotch area, around his knees, around his elbows, around his neck and his back, where his shoulders start to come into play, is a confusing place. I threw a joint in his mouth just so that I would be able to do the very most basic mouth movement if it came to that. It looks super silly, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to use it, but there's just so that there's at least one bone in his body that he could talk with. The hands are another place that need some nuance. I didn't set the joints up in his hands very good, to be honest. They're not oriented really awesomely, but it was something I decided it wouldn't be too much of a bother to just work around that when animating, so I decided to leave them kind of malformed. Deciding how that special extra wide finger worked was kind of an interesting challenge. Basically, it was another place where I had to compromise the quality in order to make that weird hand work. After I got the skin in at least, close, I'm sure I made more edits to the skin after that. I moved on to putting constraints in for inverse kinematics in the feet, and I made these control objects with the intention of incorporating them into the rig, and eventually decided that it just was cluttered, and this was such a simple rig that I wasn't going to worry about it. There are also control objects for where his knees point, and I went through and tested out the poses that he can make with this skin. I'm relatively happy with it. It came together very fast, and it doesn't have a lot of controls. It's in a good place for me to animate really quick and dirty with it without getting too complicated, but it still has enough bones for me to put some nuance in if I need to get a really subtle animation. Mostly this is a big picture kind of rig, big movements. I do have to adjust the feet to be flat on every step, but that's not too much of a hassle.